All right, in this video I wanted to talk through a little bit of a complication in genetics, and that's when we have to deal with sex-linked traits. So I want to introduce a little bit of information about what sex-linked traits are, and then we'll walk through solving a genetics problem related to a sex-linked trait. So let's start by considering what we mean when we say something's sex-linked. Okay, and that's going to relate in a way to sex determination. That is how it is figured out genetically if an individual will be male or female. And so in humans, it's the X and the Y chromosomes that determine an individual's sex. So I hope it's familiar to you that if a person is born with two X chromosomes, that person will develop as a female. But if a person is born with one X and one Y chromosome, they will develop as a male. So what sex we are is determined by our chromosomes, specifically the X and the Y chromosomes, and we call those the sex chromosomes. So let's look at how we can observe evidence of this in by looking at our chromosomes. So again, females have two X chromosomes. You can generate an image of all the chromosomes from someone's cells, and this image is called a karyotype. So here's a karyotype taken from a female donor. So here we can see a photograph of all their chromosomes. Here's the two copies of chromosome number 1, and then over here are the two copies of chromosome number 2. And they're ordered all the way down here. It's chromosome 22. And then there are two of these X chromosomes and no Y chromosome. So again, females, we know, have two X chromosomes, and we can actually visually see that through this karyotype process. Again, if females have two X chromosomes, males are different. Males have one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. So here's the same kind of karyotype image, but this one was generated from a male. Again, chromosome 1, we can see the two copies up here, chromosome 2, and if we go all the way to the end, we see one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. So we know that this sample came from a male donor. So let's learn more about that Y chromosome, the one that's different in males. Females never have this chromosome. So the Y chromosome is generally very small. It only carries about 200 genes. In comparison to all the other chromosomes, most chromosomes have somewhere around 1,000 genes. So the Y chromosome is way smaller. And again, we can see that. Here's another electron microscope image of chromosomes. The small one up here is the X chromosome. This much larger one the small one right here is the Y chromosome. The much larger one is the X chromosome. And so remember, no female ever has the Y chromosome. And I think we can use that to learn something about the Y chromosome. And that's that the Y chromosome serves a very specific purpose. The Y chromosome genes mainly aid in male development. So this small chromosome helps males develop as male. But other than that, it's not really necessary. And we know it's not necessary because females never have the Y chromosome. If there was anything truly important about the Y chromosome, females would need it too, but they don't have it. So that's how we'll consider the Y chromosome here, is that it's a chromosome that makes someone male, but is otherwise unimportant. Of course, that's a vast oversimplification in terms of genetics, but for our purposes, that's how we can move forward. The Y chromosome is only important for creating someone as a male. And we know it's not important for other things because females don't have it. All right. So that leads me to one other piece of terminology I want to introduce related to these sex-linked traits associated with the X chromosome. We'll talk more about them. But we need this other piece of terminology, which is the word hemizygous. So I think we've learned some other words that end in zygous before, right? Like we've learned the word homozygous. Homozygous is just a piece of terminology that tells us an individual has two copies of the same allele. They might have the two dominant alleles, or they might have the two recessive alleles. So we've used that terminology in the past. We've also used the terminology heterozygous. Again, that just means that the two alleles an individual has are different from one another. So they have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. So today we want to introduce this term hemizygous. Hemizygous means that they only have one allele. There aren't two copies. So we can't use these pieces of terminology that compare the copies and say, are they the same or are they different? But rather, we have to use this terminology that says there is only one copy, hemizygous. Why is that important for us? Well, males are hemizygous for any trait associated with the X chromosome. I'm male. I have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. So any genes that are on the X chromosome, I only have one copy of them. My Y chromosome has that stuff that turned me into a male, but nothing else that's important. So for every X-linked trait, I am hemizygous. I only have one copy. So let's think about what that means genetically. All right, so there are traits that are that are found on the X chromosome. Again, we're going to call them X-linked traits. We might also call them sex-linked traits. Again, that just means that that trait is associated with the X chromosome. So there are several examples. Here are three particularly common disorders that are X-linked. Hemophilia, right? Bleeding disorder. That's an X-linked trait. Another disorder called Duchenne muscular dystrophy, okay, where our muscle fibers stop working quite correctly, is a X-linked trait. And maybe the most common one is being red-green colorblind. That's another X-linked trait. So this gene that controls whether an individual can or cannot distinguish the colors red and green is found on the X chromosome. And again, males like me, we only have one copy of that X chromosome, so we only get one copy of this gene. So let's think more about red-green colorblindness as an example of how sex-linked traits work. So we're going to use colorblindness as an example. Maybe you've seen some of these colorblind test patterns before. I'm going to show a few examples. Here's one. So you see this circle of colored dots, and a non-colorblind individual will see some pattern emerge from those dots, usually a number. But colorblind individuals can't distinguish the color differences between the dots as well, and so they won't be able to see the number. So here's one example. Here's another example. Again, within that pattern of dots, you might see a number or pattern. And here's a last example. So if we show these to an individual and we ask, what number appears in that pattern, we can diagnose someone as being colorblind or not. So I look at these patterns and I can't see anything. There are no number patterns that jump out at me. So I just say, hey, I just see a bunch of colorful dots, but I don't see any numbers. Maybe you do or do not see the numbers yourself. So I am a colorblind individual. So let's use me as an example to think about how we can answer some questions related to the genetics of these X-linked traits. So let's add a little bit more information about colorblindness. So we're going to have this question that we're going to answer. We're going to say, in humans, the allele for normal color vision is dominant, and the allele for red-green colorblindness is recessive. And we already know that this trait is X-linked. So a male, that's me, who is colorblind, again, I'm a colorblind male, has parents who are both non-colorblind. So again, that's true about me. My mother is not colorblind, and my father is not colorblind. And I have this question for you. What is the probability that my parents would produce a son like me that is colorblind? So let's think about how to answer that question. All right. So I'm going to use the same kinds of steps we've talked about in the past approaching this problem. So the very first thing we're going to do is choose some symbols to represent the genes. So again, we have this information. We know colorblindness is sex-linked or X-linked. Whenever I tell you that something's sex-linked or X-linked, I'm going to say that you should include the X and Y chromosomes in your symbols. So let's look and see what that appears like. And again, for colorblindness, we said that normal color vision is dominant and colorblindness is recessive. So what symbols would I use? Well, I would use the X chromosome, and then right next to that X chromosome, I'm going to use a letter, like the letter B for blindness, to denote the allele. So I could have an X chromosome that has the dominant B. That's going to be normal color vision. Or I can have an X chromosome with the recessive B. That's going to be colorblind. And then finally, we could have the Y chromosome. Again, the Y chromosome doesn't have these important genes, so there's no color vision allele on it. But I'm going to use it as a placeholder, and it's going to help me answer the question. So, two different alleles, but we've also got the two different chromosomes, and we're going to keep these lumped together. This B is going to stay with this X chromosome, this B will stay with this X chromosome, this Y will never have a B associated with it. So those are the symbols we'll use. Again, I recommend the next step is that you create a list of all the possible genotypes and their phenotype. So again, we know color vision is dominant, color blindness is recessive. We came up with these symbols. And so we can make a list of all the genotypes and phenotypes. So people require 2 copies of the sex chromosomes. They either have 2 X's or 2 Y's. So I think there's several combinations we can make. We could have 2 X's that both have the dominant allele. This individual's phenotype would be female. They've got 2 X chromosomes. And they have normal vision because they have 2 dominant alleles. Another combination would be 2 X chromosomes, but where the alleles are different on each chromosome. This individual would be female, again with normal vision. They have 1 dominant allele. Next, we could have 2 X chromosomes, but now they've both got the recessive alleles. This person would be female, but they would be colorblind. We could have an X and a Y. Again, the X will have a colorblind allele on it. This one has the dominant one. So this person will be male, XY, with normal vision. And then finally, we could have X with the recessive allele and a Y. This will be a male with color blindness. So the next step is to determine the genotypes of the parents in the cross. So I said in my question that we have a male who is colorblind, that's me, has 2 parents that are not colorblind. So we know my father is male, he's XY. And if you look back at that list from the last slide, the only way to be a non-colorblind male is to have this genotype, X with the dominant allele, Y. But then my mother, again, she's not colorblind. If we look back at the list, we see that females can either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous, and either of these would make them colorblind. But we have to figure out which my mother is. And I would point out that we know that my mother and my father produced a colorblind child. That's me. And that in order for me to be a colorblind child, I had to get a recessive allele from somewhere. I could not get it from my father. The only place I could get it is from my mother if she was heterozygous. There is no way my mother could be homozygous dominant. So we can rule that one out, and we know my parents are these 2 genotypes. So the next part is to think, well, what gametes will they make? Right? So again, we know my father is X big B Y. We know my mother is X big B, X little b. Each gamete will contain one of those sex chromosomes, one of the X's or the Y. So we know my father can either provide the X with the dominant B or give me the Y chromosome. My mother can give me the X with the dominant B or the X with the recessive B. So our very last step is to complete a Punnett square with that information. I'm running out of time on my video, so I'm going to stop here and finish in one last segment in another video.